right before he was to take the stand, and a couple weeks before, he took the stand on March 27th, 1931. It was on a Friday. A couple weeks before that, he had received on two separate occasions 2 anonymous notes in the mail that said Notre Dame will be embarrassed more than you'll ever know if you testify.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't name him. They didn't name Rockne. Nobody. Just Notre Dame will know. Or Notre Dame will be embarrassed.
Page 78 of your book. I wrote that quote down. I'm looking at it right now. You heard that there. That's author Jeff Harrell talking about threats that Father Reynolds, a priest at Notre Dame, received as he was about to testify in the trial of a Chicago mob murder that he witnessed. More of that later, but first, thank you for listening to another episode of Round the Bend Now and Then. My name is Matt Emery, and I'm a local history nerd. My main mission in this podcast, as well as other Round the Bend material, is to create engaging content that shares how intertwined the South Bend and Mishawaka area's past is to our present. In the podcast, I interview local leaders, business owners, and community members to help tell their stories, because their stories help tell the story of South Bend and Mishawaka. Before we get into the interview, I just have a few announcements and favors. Announcement: all of our previous audio episodes are now uploaded to YouTube, and as each one is released, they'll also be available on YouTube as well. In addition to the audio episodes, I'll continue to create visual content as well. I currently have 3 different video episodes, each with historical pictures, maps, dynamic narration by yours truly, and even on the scene videos and reporting, also by yours truly. Be sure to go to our YouTube channel at Round the Bend Now and Then, subscribe, and check out the content. A few favors: as always, please be sure to hit the download, like, or subscribe button on whatever podcast app that you listen to us on. Follow us on social media at Round the Bend Pod or at Round the Bend 574 on Twitter, Round the Bend Now and Then on Facebook, and all of our links are in the show notes as well. My last favor is to please pass on the good word about the content. Now, here is the introduction setting up another interview that helps tell the story of South Bend and Mishawaka. On March 31st, 1931, the airplane carrying legendary Notre Dame football coach Knute Rockne crashed into a Kansas farm. And not just football fans, but America mourned the loss of football's most accomplished and best coach at the height of his career. But remember, this was 1931, the early days of aviation and the beginning of commercial aviation, kind of a Wild West era. There weren't many government rules and regulations, and when planes crashed, there were hardly any consistent protocols and procedures to follow. And this includes the crash that Rockne was killed in. The crash site was completely unsecured. There were people collecting plane parts as souvenirs, which obviously would make the investigation that much more challenging. There were conflicting reports of what might have even caused the plane to crash. And all of this was absolutely magnified by the fact that it was the very first time that a plane carrying such a high-profile person crashed. And almost a century later, there has been no official cause of the crash determined. But the prevailing theory is one of the wings failed, causing the plane to kind of spin out of control and then crash. Then on January 7th, 1933, almost 2 years after the tragic death of Knute Rockne, a Detroit Evening Times headline would read, "Bomb Killed Rockne, Put in Plane by Gang." At the time, that headline and ensuing article didn't really catch the attention of many people, and it fizzled out. It definitely would have caught my eye, and it caught author Jeff Harrell's eye when he read that article a few years ago. From there, curiosity got the best of the retired journalist, so he dug deeper and found documented newspaper articles, official reports, interviews, and more that told a bit of a different story as to why the Rockne plane crashed. While the murmurs of the bombing theory had circulated for years, the story hadn't really been documented, compiled, and shared in a comprehensive manner. So that is exactly what Jeff did. With his love of writing, football, and Knute Rockne, he wrote a book, As God's Witness, The Death of Knute Rockne. In this episode, I meet with Jeff remotely from his Indianapolis home. I'm miffed at myself for not reading this book sooner, but folks, I ingested it in about 2 days. And as I harp on in the episode, it's written in a fun manner that's engaging and it really puts you on the scene. And as he says, he wanted to write it more as a crime novel, and he definitely hit that mark. I really just wanted to be able to pick his brain enough for our listeners to be able to understand the gist of this wild story. And as I've said multiple times on this podcast when I interview authors, these episodes only touch the surface of the twists and turns that their books contain. And as God's Witness is no different. You simply can't get the ups and the downs of the book without reading the book. So I highly encourage you to check out Jeff's website, spiritofknute.com, and purchase the book. He also has an expanded hardback version that he says is the most comprehensive collection of Rockne pictures and stories that's out there. So head to his website, spiritofknute.com, purchase the book, read it, and then reach out to me and let me know your thoughts. And while you're surfing the interweb on your phone, I need your help. Please be sure to download, like, subscribe the show on every podcast app that's possible. Apple, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon Music, etc. An extra favor on those apps. Please leave a review or click on the 5 stars if you love the content. And now, here is my interview with author Jeff Harrell. Can you just briefly introduce yourself, where you're from, your interests, your career, all those things?
Well, Jeff Harrell, born and raised in Indianapolis. Graduated from Broadville High School.
Nice.
Played basketball and baseball at Broadville.
Nice.
I went on to Ball State. Graduated from Ball State, and with Tom and Neil Raby and that whole, our family.
Uh-huh.
And played baseball at Ball State, and
Nice.
graduated with a journalism degree, and started my newspaper work in early 80s in Fort Lauderdale.
Uh-huh.
In Fort Lauderdale, and covered music and covered entertainment and news. And I mean, I'm a career newspaper man.
Okay.
I guess the most significant part of my career was 10 years in New York City as a police and crime reporter for a daily paper there in Staten Island. And I was also a court reporter. I was a bureau chief at Brooklyn Federal Court, Manhattan Federal Court, Eastern and Southern Districts of New York, and Staten Island Supreme Court. And
wow.
Covered a lot of mob trials.
Uh-huh.
And got on a first name basis with some guys that you probably read about, and so
that's cool.
And came back to South Bend and worked for the Tribune for a few years and retired from there and continued to play music, wrote my book, and here I am talking to you.
That's great. So in Indiana to Fort Lauderdale to New York, and then back to Indiana.
Then back to Indiana, back home again.
And man, I could probably spend an hour talking about the mob stuff, but because I love that. But your book talks about it as well.
It does.
Before we get into the book here, I want to take a few minutes just to highlight your book. And as I'm reading it over the past few days, I mean, it is so fascinating. As God's Witness, The Death of Knute Rockne. And it kind of challenges the conventional reasons of what people think is plane crashed. And we'll get more into that later. But I'm telling you, your writing style, you take some drier newspaper articles and you make it alive, like you personify it. And not just that, I mean, your book, in addition to the actual death of Knute Rockne, I mean, anybody who's into organized crime like me, I mean, I have probably 30 or 40 different books of organized crime. I mean, you do a great job of helping the readers understand that. Anyone who's into Knute Rockne, I mean, my goodness, all his side hustles, Studebaker, the speeches, the details about, I mean, even the details of his flight. I mean, I learned about early aviation. I mean, and even local history here in South Bend. I mean, so anyway, I highly encourage all of our listeners to check this book out because you truly can just ingest it in a couple days. But anyway.
I appreciate you, brother. I do. Thank you.
Talk to me about the background behind it, like why you wanted to write the book.
Actually, it started out as a coffee table book for a guy that I knew who had all these photos. But then one afternoon, and I was helping this guy kind of put together, just all this stuff that he had compiled with Rockne, especially these photographs. And I was at Augie's one afternoon, and he had that newspaper headline. He showed me and said, bomb killed Rockne, put in plane by gang. And from 2 years later. And I had heard bits and pieces of about Father Reynolds, but I wound up by distance being interviewed with a descendant cousin of his.
Okay.
A man named Jim Manigan out in Bellows Falls, Vermont, which is where Bellows Falls, Vermont, which is where Father Reynolds is from.
Okay.
And he sent me the last taped interview that Father Reynolds did in 1986 with this Christian newspaper at the monastery he was living in Oregon. So I have and he sent me the tape, and I have Father Reynolds' actual voice talking about this whole story from an eyewitness perspective. Anyway, I just kind of ran with it.
Yeah.
From there, that's what and I joked about it at the time, but it was only half joking. That's what you get when you give a coffee table book to an investigative reporter from New York. You turn into, a mom story. So.
Oh goodness. And before we get into we'll get into the airplane crash and some of the circumstances surrounding it. I mentioned that you do a very good job of describing Knute Rockne at the time. And at this point in 2024, he's more like a mythical figure, but the dude was a real person, and he was big. Talk to our listeners just about how big that Knute Rockne was at that time, not only in South Bend, but across the country.
Well, let's get back to 2024 for a second, or when I wrote, when the book came out, which is just within the past couple of years. Rockne was all but forgotten. He wasn't even a myth. I mean, he was, you saw the statue at the North Gate, and that's about it. And and I talked to players and coaches.
Okay.
Former players and coaches. I said, how much did you really know about, Rockne? They said, nothing.
So okay.
During his time, you got to understand, Knute Rockne shaped the football.
Literally
shaped the football, literally, and so it would fit in Harry Stuhldreher's hands, so he could make it more comfortable for him to pass in the first passing offense ever schemed by a coach in history. An entire offense was schemed around the pass for the first time. So he made the football, which at the time was like maybe a little more streamlined or simulated version of like a medicine ball. You couldn't throw it. But Rockne also basically the passing game today. The NFL sells tickets because of the passing game. Let's be honest with you. That's the most exciting part of the game. Well, it was Knute Rockne who developed the route tree while he was working out with Gus Doré before their senior year in Ohio, in Sandusky, Ohio. So you've got a guy that literally set the foundation for today's modern game. But that's just the football aspect of it and his X's and O's. Right. He worked the entire time, and you got to understand, the NFL didn't start until 1920.
Oh, it was all
Rockne's
college
first
football.
Season was college football was 19. Rockne started in 1918, I think, or
something around
18
there.
or 9. I can't remember whether it's 18 or 19. And but Rockne worked tirelessly to sell the game and sell Notre Dame football and sell the game cross country. From New York, where he played the annual Army game in Yankee Stadium.
Right.
That was Rockne. So he was taking he took the team across to Hawaii, which Hawaii wasn't
even a state yet.
Being a state. Exactly. So he introduced basically the game of football on a national level, while at the same time he was the national spokesman for Studebaker.
Right.
And he was back and forth there, so he was mixing both Notre Dame and his Studebaker.
So I want to get into the crash a little bit, but before we get into it, there's two pretty important figures leading up to the deadly airplane crash, and we've kind of heard their names already. I want to talk a little about Jake Lingle first, and then we'll talk about Father Reynolds, and then we'll talk about how those two forever became connected. Let's talk about Jake Lingle. Quick background about him. He's from Chicago. What's his role?
Chicago. He was a newspaper. They called them reporters back then, which I'll just he was not a writer.
No,
he barely knew how. I mean, there was no. And I researched a lot about him.
Yeah,
especially from the newspaper man's point of view.
Right.
From my point of view, I wanted to see, well, how did this work back then?
Yeah.
And it wasn't. I mean, he was not uncommon. I mean, it was very common back then for newspapers to have their street people.
Yep.
And I mean, I believe even the great broadcaster Walter Winchell had a street guy who actually did the reporting for him, and he just basically read it.
Oh, okay.
But what Jake Lingle would do, his job basically he made $65 a month or $65 a week.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yep.
$65 a week as a reporter at the Tribune. That was his salary. And his job was basically he was the street guy. He was their street guy. His job was to get into the cracks of the alleyways, and find out the guys behind the guys behind the guys. And this was everybody from the police department to City Hall to Capone to Bugs Moran. His job was to cultivate sources and cultivate people to talk to him and get information, then get on the phone and call his story to the editors and the writers back in the newsroom that actually took the stories and wrote them. But he was very well known in those circles there. And so anyway, on the side, he was making around. He had a bank account of about what? It was like $65,000-$70,000 bank account.
Yep.
And I mean, he would go to he went to bet the horses every day. He was a huge horse racing guy, but he was on Capone's back. He was Capone's bag man. He was delivering envelopes to the crooked politicians and the crooked cops, for Capone. And Jake's problem was that he would give money to procure these favors as loans, and he never paid anybody back, nor procured the favor. And in time, even his buddy Capone, who they were good friends enough, Capone gifted him with that diamond-encrusted belt buckle with these initials on it, that Capone gave his best buddies. But he finally, Capone had the last straw, and he said, "Look, it was over as something that they were trying to open up a new club up on the north side, and that had to reopen it. Yeah, and Jake was gonna make sure the cops and everybody were paid off that wouldn't stop them from booze. Booze was the big thing. This was during Prohibition. Right. So anyway, he didn't do that, and he wanted a bigger cut of the operation. And that got back to Capone, and Capone basically said, I've had enough of this guy.
Before we get what happened to Jake Lingle, let's talk a little bit about a gentleman named Father Reynolds.
Father Reynolds was orphaned at the age of 5 when he lost his mother. And his father, I think he had 4 or 5 brothers, and he had a sister and 4 or 5 brothers. And the father was a mechanic for the ferry in Hoboken. He was born in New York. And couldn't take care of the kids, and because of his job, and so he farmed them off to relatives. Well, Johnny Reynolds, that's what little Johnny Reynolds,
tough little shit.
He was uncontrollable. He was like, he was just He lost his mother, and they put him in an orphanage in Bellows Falls, Vermont, where they had family.
Mm-hmm.
And relatives took the other kids. Well, finally, he was raised by an uncle, Edward Reynolds, who was the local priest there in the town, and he was a leader. He was a leader in the town as far as, I don't know what kind of mill. They had some kind of a mill there, paper mill or something, and they would call Father Reynolds in to like avert strikes and to kind of quell tensions and all that. So that Father Reynolds took his nephew in and raised him into he was in high school. He had kind of gotten out of his fighting stage, and turned into like he was an honor roll student, and he was a star athlete. He was a star track runner, and wound up going to Notre Dame. His uncle said Notre Dame had a good English department because he wanted to teach too. So got to Notre Dame and was ordained a priest in, I think, 22, something like that. And became friends with Rockne when Rockne was his coach in track. And they were, even though Rockne was a little bit older than him, they became friends that continued when Father Reynolds was a professor at Notre Dame.
And now, a brief word from one of our sponsors. I want to thank In Rug Co. for sponsoring this episode. All of Round the Bend Now and Then's podcasts, interviews, YouTube videos, and social media posts are all focused on local South Bend, Mishawaka, and Granger content. In addition to creating the content, I'm currently at the point where I am now working to partner with businesses and organizations to sponsor episodes. But not just any old business. I'm striving to seek partners who are local businesses or a local organization, because being a part of their growth or success means that I'm contributing to the overall success of our community. And In Rug Co. is as local as you can get. If you've never heard of In Rug Co., let me tell you. Indiana Rug Company started in 1985 right here in the South Bend and Mishawaka area, specializing in custom handmade area rugs. And almost 30 years later, they're still going strong. They're still creating beautiful, one-of-a-kind area rugs and offering other carpet binding services. But they've grown into so much more. They opened a brick-and-mortar retail store, In Rug Co. Studio and Gift Shop, located at 220 East Mishawaka Avenue in Mishawaka, right across from the entrance to Central Park. In Rug Co. itself is located in a cool, old, historic Mishawaka storefront, but what's inside is even better. I can pretty much tell you that any fan of this podcast and other Round the Bend content would be a fan of In Rug Co., as the first thing that caught my attention as soon as I walked inside was the selection of locally themed merchandise. I mean, where else are you going to find Scottsdale Mall or USA Skate Center merch or a t-shirt that says Michiana versus everybody? Nowhere. The whole front of the store contains locally themed t-shirts, coffee mugs, magnets, stickers, and much more. Now that's the area that you had to drag me out of. Then there are other areas in the store that I literally had to drag my wife out of. It seemed like she had a gift picked out for everybody. For our moms, our sisters, and our nieces, she found some really cool purses, aprons, jewelry, artwork, and other neat decorations. For our sons and nephews, she found some stylish outdoor gear and clothes. And once I dragged her out of that area, I discovered that they have a really cool outside patio area where you can buy one-of-a-kind yard decorations, wind chimes, patio art, and more. Then, when you're tired from all the shopping and need something sweet to eat, look no further than Lola's Pastry, Bread, and Jam Bakery, located right inside of In Rug Co. All of their sweet treats are baked from 100% scratch using no preservatives. To truly get a sense of all that In Rug Co. has to offer, you have to visit their store. Again, at 220 East Mishawaka Avenue, across from the Central Park entrance. Once you're there, you'll understand why I'm describing this place so enthusiastically and why I'm so excited that I get to advertise for them, as they are a locally owned small family business who is entrenched in our community and dedicated to seeing it thrive. I think their own description of In Rug Co. says it all. If you are tired of big box retail stores without personality and artistic flair, our studio offers a true shopping experience with genuine customer engagement and service. And folks, go to their website, indianarugco.com, to check out all that they have to offer. I included a link in the show notes as well. And now, back to the episode. And then from now, what happened? Literally, it's almost 94 years ago to the day, June 9th, 1930. Mm-hmm. What happened on that day that would forever connect Father Reynolds with Mr. Jake Lingle?
Father Reynolds was on the train to go to Chicago. He had sinus problems, and he was a heavy smoker. He even admitted, he joked about it, but he had sinus problems from, and I think he had his nose broken in a fight too. And that it caused him, that it never healed right. So anyway, he was on his way to the doctor in Chicago. Gets off the train, sees, meantime, Jake Lingle has walked is on his way to the horse track. And he's reading the racing form, waiting to catch the train there. He sees Father Reynolds get off the train, and he kind of nods to him.
Mm-hmm.
And Father Reynolds nods back, and to anybody going to the horse track, a nod back from the priest is going to be, hey, I'm okay. I got a good blessing to go to the track today. So the minute he did that, Father Reynolds looked up, and there was two men standing behind Jake Lingle, and this was a crowded rush hour train station down underneath the Grant. It's the Grant Park station now.
Yep.
He sees the one guy pull out a gun and fumble it. The other guy grabs it and puts it behind his head and fires a bullet and then takes off. Father Reynolds rushes to Lingle's side, and Lingle's breathing. He picks up his head and he leans down, and Lingle whispers words into his ear.
Yep.
Which is a last confession to a priest.
Mm-hmm.
That's as sacred as a priest, can do.
Right.
So, and after that, there was chaos in the building. Father Reynolds wound up seeing the other guy, the guy who fumbled the gun. He saw him on the street, but that guy took off, and then Father Reynolds went back and just decided to catch the first train back to South Bend.
And eventually, he was asked to testify, And he had to go back and forth between Chicago to identify the suspects. And that's scary stuff, too, because this is 1930s gangland.
Father Reynolds, once it got picked up in the papers that there was a priest, that's when the police kind of started digging, and they found, and they went to his superiors at Notre Dame first.
Okay.
Father Reynolds did not want to testify at first because he thought not only that, there was a dilemma. He had a spiritual dilemma with, he heard this guy's last rites, final confession, which is sacred and private, and what happens if the police need to hear that and they subpoena him, and he didn't want to get into that. Well, his superiors finally talked to him, and there were three of them in the room, and when they told him, they said, "Look, we're going to leave it up to you," but they said, "We highly suggest that you cooperate."
Wow.
So he did, and but he let it out early that he was not going to say that like that.
Right.
Well, in the meantime, through a series of events, the mob guys found out about the priest, and through their contacts with the police, Father Reynolds' name got out. So in the next few months, they showed up on campus. Even the guy who he saw pull the trigger confronted him, and his Frankie Foster confronted him at a train station on the street in Chicago once. Yeah, which I have in my book.
Yeah.
And but the real dilemma came when they arrested the wrong guy. They arrested Leo Brothers, and Father Reynolds knew. He said, "You don't have, that's not the guy."
Yep.
And the police are like, "Well, we'll handle this." But then the state attorney came in and said, "Well, if you can't," he says, I can't identify that man." Said, "Well, we can't use you." He said, "Good, I'm out of here." And the guy turned around and said, "No, we can use you."
Yeah.
And so he was, right before he was to take the stand, and a couple weeks before, he took the stand on March 27th, 1931. It was on a Friday. A couple weeks before that, he had received on two separate occasions 2 anonymous notes in the mail that said, "Notre Dame will be embarrassed more than you'll ever know if you testify." And they didn't name him. They didn't name Rockne. Nobody. Just Notre Dame will know. Or Notre Dame will be embarrassed.
Page 78 of your book. I wrote that quote down. I'm looking at it right now.
Man, I don't even know that. I couldn't even tell you that. And the day he testified, and when they ask him if that's the man, he says he answers the description.
That's it. Like, that's all he said. It sounds so political.
That's all they got. He answers the description. They even tried to press him, and he says, "I just told you."
Yep.
So anyway, he gets off the stand, goes back to South Bend. The next day, he's strolling on campus, and who does he run into but Knute Rockne? Rockne says he's got to be in L.A. the next week to sign a movie deal, and he's having a hard time finding a plane ticket. Father Reynolds, who had worked out in Oregon before he came back and used the West Coast as a getaway place.
Right.
He had already bought a ticket after the trial to get away from everything and go out there, but he couldn't leave because the trial was still going on.
Yep.
So he told Rockne, he says, "Here, just take mine." He says, and 3 days later, the plane exploded.
Man, and that's where I wanted to talk about next. And this is perfect. Man, there were some, even before the plane took off, and obviously we want people to read the book. So your book has so many more details and descriptions and everything. So, but we can kind of get into it just a little bit. There were some peculiar circumstances before the plane even took off. Like, they had to wait 45 minutes for what?
A late mail shipment.
Mm-hmm.
They took out, it was a 7-seat plane. I think it was a 9-seat plane, a Fokker Wooden F-10.
Mm-hmm. And
they took out, I think, 3 or 4 seats to move in 88 pounds, like 5 or 6 big one of the big mail bags.
Right.
And they brought all these, it was like 92 pounds. This was in the official, the Department of Commerce official accident investigation report post-crash that wasn't made public until 2006.
That wasn't made public until, wow.
No, it was a private, it was a private thing that they kept that completely under wraps. All this stuff is in the report.
Right. Oh yeah, you researched.
I spent 3 years researching this book. And then another 3 years. Yeah.
Ooh.
And the interesting and what made my research accessible, I will say, extremely conveniently accessible. I went on newspapers.com. Okay.
Rabbit hole city.
Exactly. During that time, I'm researching all of the Rockne crash.
Yeah.
Well, they would have the Rockne crash on one side. That trial was still going on. They had details from that trial, including the day Father Reynolds testified, and his testimony was in this story.
That's wild.
So I'm getting all these, and I remember the one I got from the Boston Globe about the family and the boys that went there afterwards. And the side stuff that I was able to get details from these other newspapers just through newspapers.com. But I was able to call information from both the trial going on and this thing and just piece everything together.
Yep.
And so it made it It was a lot, but it was just fascinating. I mean, I'd see some little tidbit that was just like, wow, it's just eerie how how everything just was. It was like a perfect storm.
And I tell you, when you read those old newspapers articles, that's where I get most of my research too. I love it. I mean, you can go down rabbit holes if you're not focused enough. But the way that they wrote is so different. I mean, because they're writing like it's a novel almost, some of them, the descriptions and everything. And because they had to, because there wasn't TV, we couldn't see it. And just so that's just so intriguing as well. Definitely.
Yeah.
Next, a brief word from one of our sponsors, a sponsor that most of our fellow local history buffs would love. I want to thank Augie's Locker Room for helping to support the podcast. If you've never heard of Augie's, let me tell you, Augie's Locker Room is a Notre Dame sports memorabilia and gift shop. And folks, the words memorabilia and gift shop really don't sum up the place. You walk into Augie's and it is literally a Notre Dame sports museum. From leather helmets to autographed footballs, championship rings, game-worn cleats and gear, and even my favorite football player ever, Joe Montana's jersey. Augie's Locker Room recently moved and is located about a mile from Notre Dame's campus at 1733 North Ironwood Drive in South Bend, Indiana. That's right near the corner of State Road 23 and Ironwood. I highly recommend that you stop by Augie's. If you have a loved one in your life that's a Notre Dame fan, stop by and find that perfect original gift for them. If you are a Notre Dame fan, stop by Augie's and buy that perfect gift for yourself because you deserve it. And at the same time that you're shopping and looking at all the historic memorabilia, you might learn something you didn't know about Notre Dame sports history from Jim, the owner. He's a great dude, very knowledgeable, and most importantly, passionate about Notre Dame and the South Bend and Mishawaka area. Again, folks, check out Augie's Locker Room at 1733 North Ironwood Drive. I mean, any place that has a phone number of 574-277-NDND, you gotta check it out. Or stop by their website, augieslockerroom.com. I also put a link of the website in the show notes, or you can find them on Facebook, Augie's Locker Room. Now, back to the episode. We mentioned it several times. The plane exploded, bomb, this, that. Talk to me about how those witnesses at first were they talked about that's what they heard, but then that kind of lightened over the days following in the investigation.
I think the first reports were that there was the one kid who was on the ground, and he said he heard a plane explode in the clouds. He heard an explosion. And then he sees pieces coming down. He saw a wing completely intact. One of the wings just floating like a feather down. I think what happened was, and I did use my experience in the newspaper industry, and working with federal government agencies and all that. I don't think they wanted it out that an explosion killed the most beloved figure in the country at the time. Yep. It would have been a PR nightmare. So I think the papers, because like I said, the afternoon, that was back when we had afternoon papers.
You're right.
You know, and the first stories were coming out through the AP was Associated Press was the big one. But they had other locals, the Wichita. I forget which name the Wichita paper was, but they even had an editor fly the reporter in a plane over and land him at the crash site.
Whew.
You know, the guy was taking pictures from the air. That's where you see a lot of that was from the Wichita Eagle or something like that. But I think once it got back to the feds that, hey, this might be something a lot more than we can handle. Because this was even before the FBI was involved with any. They had no forensics.
It was a Wild West.
Nothing to do.
Wild West.
This was the Department of Commerce was the investigating agency on this, and I just don't think they wanted to deal with anything. Both the coroner's jury held in Kansas afterwards, a couple days afterwards, and the official results from the Department of Commerce were both inconclusive. This was left without a cause for years.
Which is wild.
For nearly a century.
So really, one of the theories that your book is that his plane was bombed.
I think the evidence is clear that that's more than a theory.
Mm-hmm.
I really do. I just think I don't think they wanted to deal with it.
Yep.
And even when the story came out 2 years later, the bomb put in play. I mean, the story was there.
Yeah.
They even named Father Reynolds. One paper even said they had the name of the gangster who set the bomb, but they didn't release it.
Yep.
This was they called it the Secret Service at the time. United States Secret Service. And they said it was a plot. It was a plot in retaliation for Father Reynolds testifying against Leo Brother in the brothers case.
Yep.
I mean, that story died on the vine.
Which is crazy.
It just died.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
That's
so well. I mean, hey, thank you. It fell in my lap 95 years later, or 92. I mean, and cool. I needed a break.
Oh, for sure, man, for sure. Just the crash itself also is also kind of groundbreaking in itself, and you detailed it in your book. There were several firsts. I mean, that was like the first time that federal investigators went to the damn site, right? I mean, first time that some of these results were made public, and the wooden airplanes were no longer.
This was the first, and the columnist Ernie Pyle.
Yes.
Who was a national columnist in the 20s and revered across the country. Mm-hmm. He had been for like 4 or 5 years. I mean, commercial aviation was in its infancy.
Right.
And there were crashes upon crashes. And because, I mean, it's baby steps, that's how.
Right. That's how you learn and grow.
Unfortunately, that was a dangerous thing they were doing. And there was, people were getting killed, And Ernie Pyle wrote it for a couple of years in a row. He was on the Department of Commerce to release these findings and let the public know what was going on. Mm-hmm. But they didn't want to because they thought the panic would set in and the public wouldn't buy plane tickets. So they didn't want to scare the public off. But when Rockne, there was such a clamor for the way he died, because it was him who died, because it was him. It was like less than a month later that the airplane industry, the airline industry in general, ceased making planes. We called all the wooden planes from commercial aviation and started making titanium.
Wow.
Which led, it was the birth of the airline industry as we know it now.
And you talked about that Diesel 7 or whatever flew until the early 90s, even soon after that.
Exactly. So that's exactly. Crazy. And it even was the beginning. I know McDonnell Douglas, when they were doing theirs, they started building the warplanes that they used in World War II out of metal. Okay. And they were able to they were more sturdy and strong, and they were able to carry like bombs and stuff, too. So all that was because of the Rockne crash.
Wow. Talk to me about actually publishing a book. I mean, is it more a labor of love or what?
It better be. It better be. I mean, by publishing it, it's just a matter of, you better want to do it, because it's a lot of work for.
That's what I was.
You're not going to get rich. I mean, I'm not done with this by a stretch.
Good.
But I can just say, I did this because not only did I think that this story needed to be told, it's far past time.
Because it's so engaging and intriguing.
That's why I stuck with it.
Yeah.
I'm a writer. I'm a writer for a good story. And, you mentioned the writing, behind it. I wanted to write it as a true crime novel.
Okay.
In the sense of In Cold Blood, Capote's In Cold Blood, and where he puts you right in the room with him, and
that's what it felt
that's what I strive to do. What's that?
That's what it felt like. That's what I'm saying. Like, we were right there.
Thank you. That was my goal. because I wanted to put the reader in the same building with these people.
Yeah,
and so that's why I wrote it like that. And I'm just really proud of the way it came out. I really am.
And you should be, for sure, for sure. Hey, we'll wrap it up here. What do you think Jake Lingle told Father Reynolds on his deathbed? Who knows?
Hey, your guess is as good as mine. I'm just glad Father Reynolds is on my side on this one.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Round the Bend Now and Then. Thank you so much, Jeff, for joining me and sharing your insight behind your book. And again, folks, head to his website, spiritofknute.com. Purchase the book, read the book, leave a positive review for Jeff, then reach out to me and let me know your thoughts. Join us again next time as we learn more about South Bend and Mishawaka's Now and Then.